Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. First up, quick trigger warning. Obviously, we cover some hard topics. We cover domestic violence, so if you need, please take care of yourself. I also wanted to begin with a little explanation, sort of why I'm doing this podcast, why I'm talking into my phone and hoping someone out there listens and maybe, find some meaning in it, learn something. Well, obviously, this is a pretty, important issue to me. It's pretty close to my heart, and I am hoping that if someone out there needs what we cover, needs these resources, that it'll help them along their way. Whether they're a survivor, whether they're an ally, or just someone who's curious. So that's where we're going to start on Season 1, Episode 1 of the Domestic Violence Discussion. Here's what I'm hoping. Imagine a world without domestic violence. Imagine we could just flip this magical switch and suddenly we'd be a post-domestic violence society. Right now, as it is, over half of all female homicides are by current or former intimate partners, and more 80% of women with kids are homeless because of domestic violence. Imagine that we're suddenly gone. All those lives that would be saved, all that tragedy just erased. That's not even considering the cost of those who do survive it. Looking at my own story, looking at what I experienced with domestic violence, how many years I spent in therapy, overcoming my own trauma just so I could function as an adult, just so I could function normally, learning healthy boundaries, learning how to be happy. And I know I'm not the only one with my experience. Imagine if suddenly people like me, people who survived and came out the other side, never had those barriers. Where could we be now? Well, maybe one day we'll get there. The way we start, though, is by having this discussion. So first up, what exactly is domestic violence? How do we define it? What counts, quote unquote? I decided to ask around in my local city. I spoke to local people at random to get a feel for what people think about it and how they would define it. Check it out.
I would define it as a situation where one party has control over another in a lot of different ways.
Abuse against a partner you live with, female or male.
A physical and or mental encumberment of an individual that happens in a household type setting rather than a workplace setting.
All right, so domestic violence. Officially, it's defined as a pattern of behaviors used by one partner to maintain power and control over another in an intimate relationship. All right? I really want to stress here pattern of behaviors. That's because abuse is a choice made by the abusive party. It's never caused by alcohol or drugs or mental illness. Sometimes these things can make it worse, can escalate it, but ultimately, the abusive party believes they have the right to control their partner. It's never the fault of the victim. I also want to emphasize that anyone can be an abuser, anyone can be a victim. Oftentimes, you'll probably hear me talk about in this podcast victims as being female, right? And abusers being male. Statistically, this is true. I think the CDC reported around 80% of all domestic violence victims were female. All right? So, now we know what it is. But how common is it? Once again, I asked around. And how common do you think it is?
I have no idea, but I think it's probably a lot more common than I would think.
Statistically, it's probably reported in the 20s to 30s. I think it's likely underreported and probably a lot higher than that.
I think it's more common than you would imagine, yeah.
All right, so I did some digging. So I looked at both the CDC, Department of Justice, and Bureau of Labor Statistics, as well as the National Domestic Violence Hotline, to try and find out how common domestic violence actually is. And honestly, it's pretty staggering. So about half of all men and women in the US reportedly experience psychological aggression by an intimate partner. In terms of sexual abuse, physical abuse, and stalking by a former or current partner, it's 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men have reportedly experienced this. And by the way, these are only reported numbers. Imagine how much higher this would be if we had every single incident of abuse recorded. It's pretty insane, actually. And the most at-risk age group for females, 18 to 24 and 25 to 34. Again, staggering. And although any woman or man, any person, can be the victim of abuse, typically, women who are Black or Native American are abused at much higher rates than white women. By now, we know what domestic violence is, how we define it. We also know how common it is. But what exactly does it look like? When I was interviewing people, I noticed people would tend to think about it like
Physical.
It could be physical.
Domestic violence can absolutely be physical abuse. It can be emotional abuse, but it can also be sexual abuse and coercion. It can be financial abuse. It can be stalking. It can be coercive control. All these different tactics and all these different ways abusers can take control of their partner. So, throughout season 1, we'll talk about it. We'll break each element down, what exactly it looks like, with examples. So don't worry if right now you're not quite sure how to picture it. We'll get to it in detail. And we'll start next episode, episode 2, with physical abuse. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also visit their website, thehotline.org. If you identify as an abuser or are worried you might be an abuser, please call the hotline as well. They'll be able to help you. Please remember, you're not alone.